So today we're gonna be looking at the Battle of Talas, and it's gonna be how the Abbasid Caliphate fought the Chinese. I know there's a Kings and Generals version, but I'm just going to probably look at that in my own time. I'm not gonna devote a day to that. So yeah, for now, just for this recording, I'm only gonna look at the HistoryMarche version, and yeah. I don't really have much else to say other than I'm actually really looking forward to this. The main reason being is that I'm kind of interested in seeing how, the Caliphate fights the Chinese. Like I said, we stick a lot around, like, Europe, and lately we've been kind of expanding to the Middle East, mainly with, the Muslims and whatnot. But in this channel's history, we've seldomly gone all the way to China or like the Far East. I mean, we have in a few videos, but for the most part, that hasn't really been, a big focal point. And especially with China. And for those of you who don't know, I love Chinese history because it's so unhinged. Like that one emperor who was like trying to make an elixir of life, through like, I believe it was the menstrual blood of women, and and then the what's that civil war? Wait, yeah, it was the Taiping or Taiping rebellion where that one dude claimed to be the brother of Jesus and started a civil war. That Chinese history, from what I've looked at on my own time, is so unhinged, it's hilarious. And very bloody. China is known for its big population, and when they have civil wars, there's kind of a lot of memes about it, like 1 billion died. But the casualty rates are usually described as being very high. And that's kind of a meme, but that's mainly China fighting amongst themselves. Here they're gonna be coming across a superpower in the Middle East, with the Abbasid Caliphate. And again, like, China and like the Far East feels like a completely different world, disconnected from the Middle East and like Anatolia and whatnot. So it's really cool to kind of see it like gonna clash, you know what I mean? It's like seeing two different worlds collide, and I'm not sure about how the composition of Chinese armies are at this time, what kind of tactics they use, what kind of equipment they have, how their generals fare. Like I said, I do know about like some of the Chinese civil wars, and mainly that they're very bloody, and there's a lot of manpower in China, obviously. And they have like, which makes sense due to their large population. But it'll be interesting. I think that's what I'm looking most forward to, seeing how they fight and how they do against the Abbasid Caliphate, which we know was a very powerful force. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than we should probably get to it, eh? So let's watch the Battle of Talas. How did China lose Central Asia? I'm going to assume the Chinese lose.
As the summer sun rose above the flat expanses of northern Transoxiana, figures appeared on the road, silhouetted against the morning sky. The ground trembled as the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang Empire of China marched along the banks of the Talas River. What started as a frontier dispute escalated into a regional conflict that will now be decided on the battlefield nearby. War was to come, and now it was here. Following the death of Prophet Muhammad, the swiftness of the Arab conquest was nothing short of astonishing. In less than 2 decades, the Eastern Roman Empire was deprived of its lands in the Middle East, and the Sasanian Empire was conquered entirely.
We saw this in the early Muslim expansion. For those of you who might be new, that's probably the last series I saw, so feel free to check that out. We did witness all of this happen.
But further afield, Central Asia was much harder to subdue, then settled by sedentary Iranian peoples, divided into a number of small kingdoms, principalities and city-states, as well as Turkic tribes roaming the steppes and the expanses between urban centers. Instead of fighting a single enemy, the Arab armies had to reduce the petty states one by one, facing determined resistance and contending with frequent revolts and setbacks over the next 50 years. By then, caliphal rule had passed on to the Umayyad dynasty, which saw the appointment of Qutayba ibn Muslim as governor of Khorasan, an excellent administrator and military commander who was able to make significant inroads, and through clever policies of recruiting local Iranians into his army, as well as integrating some of the petty rulers into the power structure of the caliphate, he was able to greatly pacify the region of which Transoxiana was of greatest importance. These were some of the wealthiest lands in the world during medieval times, thanks to extensive trade with China, mostly in silk and jade, and with Europe in goods such as amber, furs, honey, and walrus ivory, making Transoxiana one of the most strategically important areas on the planet. But with these territorial acquisitions, the Caliphate entered the sphere of interest of the Tang Empire of China. For several centuries, China made its presence felt in Central Asia, and during the reign of Tang Emperor Xianzong, its westward ambitions grew in scale. Xianzong was a diligent and astute ruler who, with the help of his famous 3 chancellors, is credited for bringing Tang China to the pinnacle of culture and power. Most notably, his military reforms saw the replacement of the Fubing system with the
massive militia-like armies, mostly conscripted farmers lack proper training and military discipline, lack provisions and logistics for long conflicts, focused on quality instead of quantity, through rigorous training and selection, increase efficiency by incorporating troops and tactics of other cultures. Not gonna try to pronounce that. Governors were assigned troops and provinces to administrate, collect taxes, raise additional troops, appoint officials. 500. I'm telling you, China had manpower. Like, that's probably one of their most defining traits. But 500,000 professional imperial troops trained in just a few. That's insane.
Dushi military command. Inefficient, massive conscript armies were replaced by a multicultural, well-drilled volunteer corps, enabling the Tang Empire to assemble a 500,000-strong professional army in just a few years. These reforms were what propelled the Chinese westward push. Although Tang armies rarely ventured too far west beyond the Tarim Basin, rare military interventions were launched to pacify disloyal petty kings and princes of Central Asia. But it was mostly through strong economic and diplomatic ties that China established a firm foothold in the region, which persisted even after the Umayyad conquest, with numerous city-states continuing to send embassies to China, receiving pompous, mostly symbolic titles from the emperor. This reliance on soft power and the establishment of trade agreements, as well as nominal protectorates and vassalships, enabled the Tang Empire to maintain strong influence in Central Asia without the need for military conquest. At this time, the biggest threat to China's westward ambitions was the powerful Tibetan Empire, which successfully challenged the Tang for control over the Tarim Basin, a mostly desert wasteland dotted with strategically important urban towns and cities along the Silk Road. The military importance of these urban oases was equally significant, regarded by the Chinese as the gateway to the western regions that the imperial armies could pass through to reach Central Asia. In addition, Turkic Uyghurs to the north also posed a significant threat to Tang interests in this period. But through careful diplomacy, tributes, and Xianzong reforms, by 728 AD, the Chinese managed to establish full control over this vital region. It was during this time of Tang consolidation in the vast Tarim Basin that the unstoppable Umayyad armies pushed east into Central Asia. The power of the Caliphate was such that they were able to overthrow a Chinese-backed Sogdian ruler of the Principality of Fergana and install a puppet regime right on the Tang Empire's doorstep. However, Umayyad superiority, rarely challenged before, would meet its match as the Celestial Empire moved to militarily suppress the Arab expansion.
Tesla's stock is crashing. The headlines say Elon's empire.
An intervention force of 10,000 troops marched towards the Islamic-controlled Fergana, successfully defeating the Umayyad puppet ruler before massacring 3 entire Sogdian metropolises as punishment and restoring the pro-Chinese regime back onto the throne of Fergana. The Caliphate responded by allying themselves with the Tibetan Empire and the Torgesh Khaganate, and just a year later, a combined force struck east, aiming to destroy the 4 garrisons of Anshi, from where the Tang controlled the Tarim Basin. This invasion, if successful, would have crippled China's westward military ambitions. But the Chinese dealt a massive defeat to the Umayyads at the town of Anshi, almost completely destroying their army. In the aftermath...
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, you know, when two superpowers, well, when two great powers collide, right? Like, we know it's cool to kind of see what was going on with the Umayyads here, and we did cover about, you know, their alliances with you know, some areas here in Central Asia, but obviously Kings and Generals didn't go too much into it, though maybe in the next season of the early Muslim expansion, if there be another, he might cover more, which would be cool. But it's interesting to see, just like, you know, China so far 2-0 in stopping some of the, you know, Caliphate's ambitions eastward. And yeah, it really is just this area, right? Due to its lucrativeness. Is that a word? I don't know. It's super late here, by the way, so I may not be completely coherent, but I'm recording this super late. But yeah, it's just interesting to just see this conflict and just how it's coming about, you know?
Aftermath of the battle, Turkish tribes, formerly allied to the Umayyads, switched their allegiance and launched attacks from the north, while the Tang army marched against the Caliphate from the east, effectively expelling the Arabs from Transoxiana. Never again, the Chinese thought, would the Arabs be able to meddle in the affairs of the Tang dynasty. While the Umayyads made limited efforts to re-establish their rule in the lost eastern territories, their main focus shifted west, away from the region, and with this a power vacuum was created that allowed the House of Abbas to slowly build prominence in the remote but important region of Khorasan.
Yeah, Kings and Generals also touched on this as well. Like I said, he touched on the Caliphate making alliances with some of the Turkish areas, but yeah, he also did mention the Abbasids just growing, while it seems like in the east, while things were stalling, and while the Caliphate set its eyes more westward, this is where I'm pretty sure the Abbasids just kind of grow into power, right? And yeah.
In the ensuing decades, the Abbasids carefully intrigued against the Umayyads, recruiting followers from discontented and dispossessed locals, eventually raising the banner of revolution. The revolt spread quickly under military leadership of Abu Muslim, a commander in the service of the Abbasids, culminating with the victory in the Battle of Zab, which effectively ended Umayyad rule and led to the proclamation of the first Abbasid Caliph. With most of their power base located in Persia, the new regime shifted their military focus east, recognizing the importance of the phenomenally rich lands of Transoxiana. But the cunning Emperor Xianzong exploited the instability within the Caliphate during the 3 years-long Abbasid Revolution by launching a three-pronged attack. This time, however, the Tang armies were ordered to establish a firm military foothold in Central Asia. With the Korean general Cao Xianzi in command, the emperor subjugated Tibet's strategically valuable allies, eroding their presence in the area, and vassalized roughly 72 city-states in the important mountainous regions of the Pamir and Hindu Kush.
Wow. So yeah, good. That's just smart because, again, you know, the Chinese taking advantage because the Caliphate is rising to be like, you know, kind of a bit of a problem. Sure, they dealt with them earlier on, but obviously, I think even they expected that eventually there's gonna have to be like interaction with them again. So just completely putting, I guess, establishing yourself even through this act of dominance, probably the smart way to go, especially for such a rich area, right? Like, you only have to gain through it.
With these developments, the Chinese now directly challenged the Abbasids for control over Central Asia. In the turmoil, what triggered the conflict between the two empires was a local dispute between the petty kingdoms of Fergana and Shash. The king of Fergana, having been under heavy Chinese influence for the past 35 years, asked his overlords for assistance. Cao heeded their cries for help and moved to subjugate the Shashin kingdom. The capital city was besieged, and the Tang general promised its king safe passage.
Oh.
But once the king accepted surrender and left the safety of his city walls, he was treacherously captured and beheaded. His son, however, escaped and managed to get word to the Abbasid governor of Khorasan, asking for military assistance. Sensing an opportunity to gather their forces and diminish Tang influence, the Abbasids mustered their troops and marched out of Merv. On the way, reinforcements from parts of Tukharistan that were still under the Caliphate's control were summoned to join the main army. As they approached Samarkand, Ziyad ibn Salah, a former Umayyad governor of Kufa, joined with his contingent and assumed command of the whole army, continuing the march east, determined to restore Islamic power long bereft to the steppes of Central Asia. The two armies lined up on the flat plain next to the river Talas, not far from the city bearing the same name. Accounts of the battle differ greatly, but according to the most consistent estimates by modern scholars, Ziyad commanded up to 40,000 troops. He placed archers in the front, with several rows of spearmen just behind, and a mix of heavy and light cavalry on each flank, as well as a contingent of light cavalry along with his own heavily armored bodyguard contingent in reserve. Meanwhile, Cao took to the field with 30,000 troops. He mirrored the Abbasid formation, with his crossbowmen in the front mixed with regular archers, supported by heavily armored Tang spearmen in the center and nomadic mercenary horsemen on each flank, while the Fergana contingent and his own bodyguards were further back. As the vultures circled above, the two commanders cautiously contemplated their moves. What happened next is a matter of debate, but according to one account, Cao ordered his projectile division forward to probe for weaknesses in the Abbasid line. Ziyad responded, and a brief exchange of projectiles followed. Thanks to superior missile technology, Tang crossbowmen soon prevailed, and the Abbasid archers were forced back.
That's interesting. I think this is one of the few times where we've specifically heard the mention of crossbows and utilized. It's a weapon that doesn't get much shine in these videos, at least all the ones I've seen. Not to say it hasn't appeared before, but you know, it is kind of cool to see that weapon in effect. And yeah, Gao, I think, yeah, with these names, man, this is why I'm kind of afraid to cover Chinese history, because I'm not gonna get any names correct. But I'm just gonna say Gao. Gao seems so far at the disadvantage, though, at least numerically, and again, numbers aren't everything. I know we've seen plenty of times people overcome the numbers game, but it still is, you know, a disadvantage to some degree. But it is cool to see, like, you know, kind of like what weaponry they have compared. And it does seem like, at least with their crossbows and stuff, that they seem to have at least an advantage in terms of ranged combat, which helps. Though we are really aware of what the Caliphate has. We covered the early Muslim expansion all 3 seasons, so I am kind of fully aware of what they're capable of, and their cavalry seems to be a huge advantage. Throughout that entire series, what the Muslims really had was just that cavalry, you know, like, superiority, and more often than not, that was kind of the big cause of their success. And so far, I think that might, I'm just speculating, but I think that might come into play again, because obviously they have heavy and light cavalry, meanwhile Gao mainly just has the nomadic mercenaries. And again, I'm not completely aware of what exactly the nomadic mercenaries are capable of, at least, so I don't want to completely underestimate them. It's just, you know, we do know what the Muslim cavalry and how powerful it is. So yeah, hopefully these nomadic mercenaries can hold their own against them. If not, then that's a pretty big disadvantage. In terms of just the spear infantry, I don't know, they seem so far pretty even, at least in terms of description. We'll see in terms of actual combat how one side does against the others, because we know the Muslims are great fighters. And again, I'm not fully aware of this era of China, and just we saw the military reforms, which are impressive, you know, like obviously China's having in terms of military, having quite the reforms that are helping them become even stronger, though I'm not completely sure of what they're fully capable of this era of China. But so far they've had success, so we'll see.
Cao promptly ordered his spearmen forward.
Look, you're not actually going to get anything.
The Tang commander relied, not for the first time, on the Empire's well-drilled professional troops. The trees rattled as the disciplined Chinese heavy infantry rumbled forward in unison, packed in a tight formation. Close behind, mounted mercenaries followed in support of the infantry. Ziyad moved his numerically superior infantry forward, hoping to slow down the enemy's advance and give his own cavalry more room to maneuver. As the gap closed, the troops in either line gripped their weapons and braced for impact. As the opposing armies interlocked, hacking and stabbing at each other, the scent of blood quickly filled the air. Cao signaled his cavalry on the flanks to gallop forward and encircle the Abbasid infantry.
Okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting maneuver Gao wants to do, because, like I said, it seems like just the map of the space, it seems like doing something like a flank would be harder to pull off due to the river and the mountains on the side, so it seems like the cavalry probably can't pull off like something like completely wild, like a flank out of nowhere, you know what I mean? It seems like the space, at least just by going off the map, doesn't seem the most optimal, but so this maneuver, he wants to go for the envelopment, but surely Gao must realize that the enemy has not sent in their own cavalry, and would surely want to send in their cavalry to protect their main infantry host, or, you know, so it's like, surely Gao must realize that, unless he's trying to go for it really quick, like, hopefully we can just envelop them quickly, but even then, like, it does seem like you would leave, like, surely, you know, the Muslims would try to send in their own forces to quickly stop or block, this envelopment. At least that's what I would think they would do.
Ziad immediately sent his heavy and light cavalry divisions forward to alleviate the pressure on his infantry and repel the Chinese advance. In the center, the better armored Tang spearmen pushed their counterparts back, their packed formation proving effective against the Abbasid footmen.
Wow, okay. So like I said, it's cool to just see the composition of the Chinese army, and it so far seems like, in terms of equipment, at least so far, not only with their range units, but now with their infantry, are doing much better than their Muslim counterparts. So it does seem like China really does have a lot going for it. And is even proving to be great fighting in terms of infantry. And we know the Muslims, they are great fighters. I keep saying this, but we've seen the early Muslim expansion already. We know how great at fighting, especially in infantry, the Muslims can be. So them being pushed away is already impressive in of itself, you know.
On the flanks, Ziad's heavier cavalry stopped the nomadic horsemen in their tracks, but Cao's mercenaries held strong in the face of an assault from a superior enemy force. The governor of Samarkand then sent his reserves forward, aiming to break the stalemate. He ordered his cavalry to aim for the immediate flanks of the Chinese infantry.
But it also seems like through here Gao has sent in his reserves, so I think the reserves might come across hitting each other, blocking that, which would kind of create a further stalemate, wouldn't it? Assuming that happens.
But Cao, meanwhile, moved his own reserve up the field, negating the efforts of his opponent.
Yeah, so like they like he tried the envelopment too. They both tried envelopment and were stopped right away. I kind of like that. But yeah, now it seems like it's just a stalemate. Now it's coming down to who can just outfight the other. So far in terms of infantry, the Chinese have that advantage. But again, it's the cavalry that I think might end up determining who wins. Like I said, I'm putting a lot of... I'm glazing and putting a lot of hype behind the Muslim cavalry, because we know that was kind of like, at least from the early Muslim expansion series, kind of the main source of a lot of their victories. So we're gonna have to see how these mercenaries, if they could just keep holding on, but I'm not sure if they're superior or not. Well, I don't want to say that. Like I said, I'm not sure what the mercenaries are completely made of, but holding off is probably a great next option if they can't beat them. You know what I mean?
Both armies matched each other's strength, and neither would waver. Tiredness, however, was what eventually forced the two commanders to withdraw and rest their troops. A similar stalemate continued for 2 more days, with sporadic skirmishes and head-on clashes, but neither side was able to make any significant gains. The other account of the battle, however, claims that the 2 armies stood in battle formations for 4 days without engaging each other. Perhaps neither side wanted to risk losing their army, aware that it would take a while to get reinforcements in this remote frontier region. But, perhaps unbeknownst to Cao, prior to the battle, Ziad had established contact with a contingent from one of the Turkic Karluk tribes, living in the steppes further east, recruiting them into his ranks. As small groups of riders trickled in for a couple of days, the Muslim commander concealed them in the tall grass across the Talas River. Then, on the 5th day of the battle, Ziad knew he was ready. He ordered his archers and spearmen forward, with cavalry following close behind.
Okay, this could potentially be the deciding factor, though. Okay, already, you know, the Muslims have numerical superiority, but having this hidden ally could do a lot of damage, assuming that they could join the battle in an opportune moment, perhaps when Gao has committed most of his forces, or maybe even all of them. Assuming that this hidden cavalry contingent can cross the river quickly. I'm not sure how shallow or deep the river is, but assuming that they could cross, they could hit, like, maybe a flanking maneuver? Who knows? Dude, I swear, if he wins through a flank, I'm gonna freak out. That's just speculation, that's what I would imagine, but who knows, maybe, who knows what else. That's assuming Gao doesn't, like, ever realize they're there.
The Abbasids advanced at a strong pace, while Cao had his troops slowly move forward into position. Projectile contingents of the 2 armies began exchanging volleys of arrows, with the Chinese getting the better of their Muslim counterparts. The earth groaned as the mass of Abbasid troops moved forward to meet the enemy head-on. As the infantry in the center clashed, cavalry divisions on the flanks widened their lines, trying to outflank each other. Soon, however, the Abbasid cavalry managed to force the Chinese mounted troops into a brutal static melee, as Cao's nomadic mercenaries couldn't feign retreat without exposing the flanks of the infantry in the center. Now is the time, Ziad cried out, signaling the Karluk mercenaries to attack. Emerging from the reeds, the nomadic riders galloped forward. A handful of Tang
Holy
officers
crap.
spotted the enemy on their flank, but with nearly all of their troops engaged, they desperately tried to form a line with men from their own retinues. Moments later, arrows from the east started whizzing overhead. With the Talas River behind them, the Karluk horsemen charged headlong into Cao's flank.
Holy crap. The flank. The oldest trick in the book. But there does seem to be some resistance here, but I'm not sure if that's enough.
The morale of the Tang troops on the left broke, and many tried to flee, fearing an encirclement. Ziad urged his men on, not wanting to allow the enemy to escape. The governor of Samarkand outwitted the Tang commander, and now the Chinese troops began falling in their thousands as the Abbasid army scythed through their formations. With very few survivors left, Cao ordered a retreat.
Holy crap, the mad lad did it. And he used the flanking maneuver, the oldest trick in the book, but one of the most effective still. Dang, man. Dang.
However, Chinese sources contest this outcome, claiming that it was not Zaid's superior diplomacy and tactics that won the day. Rather, the Tang account of the battle claims that the Karluk mercenaries were not across the river, but were in fact under Cao's command, laying blame on them for the defeat, after they treacherously switched sides mid-battle and attacked from both flanks. If this were true, Cao's 10,000 infantry made up only a third of the Tang army, and would stand no chance against 20,000 Karluks. But in actuality, it's most likely that both the Tang army and the Abbasids had contingents of Karluks in their ranks, and that Ziyad managed to launch a surprise attack on the last day of the battle. Whatever the case, of the 30,000 Tang troops that fought at Talas, only a small percentage survived. In the aftermath of the Battle of Talas, the significance of its outcome was not immediately clear. Strategically speaking, the battle was a tactical draw. Cao's plans for a renewed invasion never came to fruition, since the Tang Empire temporarily withdrew most of their troops east to deal with growing unrest in the north and south of the country, as well as Tibetan incursions that put further pressure on the empire.
This is a melody in Ableton Live.
Meanwhile, the eastern expansion of the Caliphate was halted. While the Abbasids could have theoretically pressed their advantage after such a crushing victory, at that time their supply lines were still not fully established, thus sending a large army east would not have been a prudent move. As a result, the Abbasid-Chinese border stabilized. But the Battle of Talas seems to have gone largely unnoticed by contemporary Chinese and Abbasid chroniclers. Nevertheless, it had important consequences. The Chinese Empire was no longer in any position to interfere in Central Asia, which meant that, in the wake of their victory, the Abbasids were there to stay. And while the Turkic and Persian population of Central Asia certainly did not convert to Islam right after the battle in 751, by driving out the Chinese, there was no longer a counterweight to the Muslim presence, which allowed the Abbasids to gradually spread their influence across the deserts, mountains, and steppes of the region. Within the next 250 years, most of the formerly Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, and Nestorian Christian tribes of Central Asia had all become Muslim. But perhaps most significant of all, among the prisoners captured after the battle were Chinese artisans, skilled in the art of papermaking. Soon, paper mills appeared in Muslim urban centers across the Middle East, and over the coming centuries the technology spread to Europe as well, fueling advances in science and theology. And, with the promotion of commerce, industry, and the arts, the prestige of the Caliphate would spread across the known world under the banner of the Abbasids. Credit goes to our awesome patrons who make videos.
Yeah, like, I remember a lot when we covered the epic history telling of the Abbasids. So, and just how culturally, scientifically, you know, like, rich they were, and it's cool to see that, and just the long-term ramifications of that lost. So overall, yeah, that was a great video, guys. That was a great battle.
Videos like this one possible. Consider East. And as always, one possible.
Okay. Had a number of tribes. Nevertheless friendly. Oh, that's cool. They ultimately became friends at the end. I guess it kind of makes sense. Like, we do know that, like, with the Persian Empire, the Sassanids, they had a kind of a relationship with the Chinese and I think the Tang. So I guess it's like, well, since this is the new empire on the block, we might as well establish relations with them. So I guess diplomacy won out, so it would seem. And yeah, I guess that's it, eh?